Hello, my name is Lauren Bailey, Deputy Editor at Markets Group, and I'm here with Celine Chiovitti, Chief Pension Officer at Canada's Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System. Celine, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren. I'm really excited to be here.
So, Celine, I'm just going to dive right in. There's a lot of change in the pension landscape right now, but I think first we should talk a little bit about what role large pension plans like OMERS plays in the broader economy and infrastructure.
So I think broader pension plans play a really significant role in economies and in communities. We sort of think about it as social infrastructure. And so if you think about the cornerstones of how communities run, one of the main things is, fiscal sustainability. And it becomes even more important in this aging world that we all kind of find ourselves in. And so we've always sort of known the impact that pension plans play on individual members in providing them access with sort of secure, stable income in their older years. And so in the most case, in more vulnerable years. But what we're really starting to dig into and do more research around is what impact that actually has on economies as a whole. And so we've just recently worked with CanCEA, the Canadian Centre for Economic Analysis, in updating some research. We did research back in 2023 to really start to demonstrate what is the economic impact that pension plans like OMERS have on the Canadian or the Ontario economy. And so we asked them to sort of run those numbers. And then the other thing we leaned into a little bit was that, social value. And so do retirees who have access to a pension plan think and feel differently than the general population? And so the insights are pretty pronounced. So what we know is based on the economic contribution in 2025. OMERS contributed about $15.3 billion to the GDP across Ontario, created about 135,000 jobs, and that resonated in about $4.2 billion in tax revenues. And so, to really demonstrate the impact, about 1 in 11 Ontarians is somehow positively impacted by the OMERS pension plan, either by the dollars that we pay out to our pensioners, and so that $6 billion that we pay out annually goes back into the economy, or by the investments that we make. And so, again, just an example of the scale and the magnitude of impact from an economic perspective. On the other hand, when I think of the social value, and so again, basically CanCEA looked at 4,000 OMERS retirees and compared them to the general population. And overall, they rated being higher with life, about 2.4 times greater in life satisfaction. They feel more financially secure. They feel less stress. They're contributing to charities and to their local communities. And so we know, that, again, just going back to the contribution it plays in public infrastructure.
That's an incredible footprint, and people don't often see the side effects and the ongoing effects of how that pension really adds to their community economy. And that said, pensions often feel complex or intimidating. How do you make this topic more digestible so that,
Yeah.
People understand the value?
I think, quite honestly, pension administrators have almost done a disservice in the past in trying to simplify what a pension is. And so the reality is, especially defined benefit pension plans that are formula-based, they are complicated. And I think we've all, through, in coming together and, through guidance and even working with FSRA, trying to simplify and really get people to think about it more as money. Like, at the end of the day, it's how you are saving for your financial future. And so in the past, I would say we lived in this, world where it was a lot of legalese as how we sort of explain things, really complicated annual statements, and talked a lot about formulas, and it was very, very difficult. And I think we've been on a path to really try and simplify. And so what that means for us at OMERS, again, more storytelling, taking 15-page documents and really, really trying to simplify it, make it more bite-sized, looking at multiple channels. And so at OMERS, Today, our youngest member is 12, our oldest is 106 years old. And so there's, such a diversity in how even just generationally people consume information. And so instead of this like one size fits all approach, we've really been trying to sort of look at multiple channels. How do we simplify? How do we give people tools and access to information? And that's a path that we've been on. I know it's a path that other of our peer plans are on as well. And so I'm hopeful. And I think this is one, area that technology really has been our friends. And we can talk a little bit more about that, but really trying to leverage it as a tool to simplify and give people access to their information.
Wonder if you're seeing more engagement and interest in pensions or retirement savings in general by younger generations, and whether you think that's a result, if indeed there is more expressed interest in just people looking for information, whether you think that's related to cost of living and the increases we're seeing today.
Yeah, I would say, one of my biggest ahas over the past few years has been, I think there's a misconception that younger people aren't interested in pensions. And what we're seeing is actually the total opposite of that. We're seeing it in research. We're also seeing it just based on, voluntary enrollments within our own plan. And so I think young people are very, very interested. I think we're living in a world that is more socially connected than ever before. And so I think younger people are paying attention. They're paying attention to social media. They're looking at what's happening across the world. They are seeing the impact, of older society who have access to income through pensions and who do not. And you're really, really starting to see them take a stand on it. I think beyond that, raised a really, really good point in that cost of living is really, really difficult. It's never been higher for this population of younger employees. And so they're starting out, quite frankly, with more debt. They're starting out with it's more difficult for them just to make ends meet. Housing affordability is really, really low. And so, with all of those things, I think people are starting to pay attention to money and to what that looks like for their future. And so, I think all of that really is leading to what we're seeing younger members and I think younger population as a whole really trying to educate themselves and build a brighter financial future.
So, are you seeing any other types of trends that, suggest, there are differences or there's change coming within the pension space, much like, the engagement we're seeing with younger generations?
Yeah. I'm always really, really interested in seeing us evolve. And I think we're seeing trends all over the place. And so I think, number one, we are seeing macro trends just with an aging society. And so as people are starting to get older, I talked about our demographic, 12 to 106. As people are starting to kind of hit their normal retiree age, they're starting to pay attention to retirement. What does that look like and feel like? And I think that has changed and evolved over the years. And so as we're getting older, we're also living longer. And so we're really starting to see this cohort of, people who are about to hit that retirement age who are asking about what should I do with my life? Should I retire? Can I, number one, am I financially able to do that? And we've always sort of been in that business and like, how do we help people, feel financially secure in their retirement? But what we're now seeing is we need to do more than that. And so again, lots of research that says, if we're retiring in our 60s and we're living until, 100 in some cases, that's a long period of time. And so how do we help our individuals who are about to retire start to think differently? And that looks different for different people. So again, moving away from this one size fits all approach to saying, how do you want to live your best life in your 60s and 70s and 80s? What does that look like? And so again, research that says, there are a few things that need to be true. Number one, you need to be able to financially afford it. And so if you have access to secure and stable income through a pension, great, you can check that off the box. But the other pieces are just as important. And so do you have social connections as you're getting older? And so what gets you up in the morning? And do you have those social connections and how can you kind of maintain those? Mental stimulation. Many of us spend our entire adult lives up until retirement working and giving back. And so should you think about doing that or replicating that? Maybe not in the same way, but how can you think about continuing that? And then, of course, being healthy. And so, what decisions can we make to be healthy? And so, what I've seen the biggest shift is, in the past, we didn't really think a lot about retirement when we first started our careers. We knew it was there, but we didn't pay a lot of attention. We definitely didn't pay attention to it sort of in the mid careers. At that point, you're kind of more focused on career building and paying off debt and trying to save to purchase a house and all of the things and having a family. And it's not until you're kind of about 5 years away from, what you would consider your normal retirement age that you start to think about retirement. And the reality is that's too late. And so what we're trying to do is say we should be thinking about it sooner and often to be prepared for that next stage in our lives. Really simple thing, an example would be if social connections are important, but I haven't really built those. I don't really do a lot in community. I've not paid a lot of attention. You can't expect one day to wake up and it will all be there. And so how do we help people transition and really prepare for that transition along their life cycle? And I think that's an exciting space for pension plans to be.
And just on that note, prepare is the big word, right? Because people don't really know, like you said, what that looks like and what type of savings they will need to have their ideal retirement lifestyle,
Yeah.
right? We see numbers and we don't often make the tie between investments and the return that you guys make, but also what we individually are putting away, right? And contributing. So how do you get them to think about that
Yeah.
earlier?
So one of the things that we're doing at OMERS, we've got 665,000 plan members. We are really fortunate in the fact that we've got a strong connection to our members. And so we have the ability to communicate directly with them. One thing that we do, I think we've done very well more traditionally, is helping people, again, prepare for their retirement from a financial perspective. We're now actually going beyond that. We're calling them these Preparing for Your 100-Year Life seminars. And so we have access to a community. We bring them together and we actually get them to workbook a bunch of stuff. So again, how do you want to, like, what is a day in the life? If you lived your actual, number one, trying to kind of get that vision of what does your ideal retirement look like? And not just one day. Think about 52 weeks. Think about, 12 months. Think about the different seasons. Like, what does your ideal retirement look like? And then start to go through exercises to say what would need to be true. And so from a financial perspective, how do you support that? If one of the things that you value most is, I want to be away 3 months out of the year traveling. Phenomenal. Okay, well, let's run the numbers. And so, like, getting them to think financially about our members are fortunate in that they have a defined benefit pension plan. And so we can, quite easily figure out what your monthly income is going to be, and that's stable and doesn't fluctuate other than cost of living kind of increases. But beyond that, do you have other savings? To your point, if you don't, how much do you need? Maybe that means you need to work a little bit longer. Maybe that means when you first retire, you continue to have a part-time job. And so really getting people to think through that. And then the other elements. And so we deal with the finances. We then deal with, again, social connections. Do you have a community? What we find is, especially if you are a married couple, really community is each other. But we don't like to think about it, but what if something happens and you are on your own? How do you build those social connections now so that you have support? And then again, the mental stimulation. Like, we can't expect people who to give their entire lives, and our members are police officers and firefighters and public health nurses and on and on. And so how do you replicate some of what you actually get there? And there's a lot of, again, just, a lot of research on it. The Blue Zones talks about the countries in the world where people live the healthiest and their longest, best lives. And it really has to do with sort of those four elements of, financial stability, social connections, mental stimulation, and health. And so if you're able to help people prepare and think through those four elements, you can then help them achieve their ideal retirement, which is going to be different for everybody.
So what exactly are some of the misconceptions that people have about
Yeah.
defined benefit pension plans?
I mean, I talked about the first one, and that is that younger people don't value them. We actually see the total opposite. Speaking for OMERS specifically, we opened up the plan to non-full-time employees back in 2023. They are predominantly younger, mostly female, and we've had over 75,000 of them volunteer to be part of the plan. And that really was over any expectation we ever had. We've also had Kensia go out and just do research that I've talked about, and active members, 90% of them have said being part of this pension plan is one of the main reasons they stay with their employer. And so I think this sort of myth that they're a thing of the past and they're just for, your older grandparents and young people don't care about them. I'm here to tell you they do. Young people today are more curious and interested and wanting to think about their financial future than ever before. And so I think that's a really big myth. I think another one is that you can be just passive. If I'm part of a DB plan, I don't need to take any action. That's not true. You need to pay attention. It's not a defined contribution plan. You don't need to make investment decisions, but there are many other decisions that you have to make throughout your career. And so I think it's really, really important that people are paying attention to it the same way you would do any other a big financial asset that you have. And then I think thirdly, look, I think the fact that, there's this concept of DB plans being very complicated and costly and, from a governance perspective. And I think there's a really, really good report out there that went to the World Bank Group. I don't even know what year it came out. It was called The Evolution of the Canadian Pension Model. And it really talked about the success of the Canadian pension system, really falling into sort of the different categories of, independent governance, no government interference, professional in-house investment management, the ability to globally invest and diversification and all of those things. And so I do think some of those kind of past misconceptions have really been clarified when you actually look at the strong governance improvements that have taken place with these pension plans over the past decades.
So I want to look a little bit forward now and just talk a little bit about what you see as the biggest governance or sustainability challenges that pensions, just like Homer's, will face in the years
Yeah.
ahead.
I mean, I think it's so interesting. I spend a lot of time paying attention to sort of global trends, and the things that I look at as the chief pension officer are trends around demographics. So, aging demographic in Canada, Canada will be a super aged country by 2030. 1 out of 4 people will be over the age of 65. And we're not alone in that. And so, you can look to Asia, you can look to Europe, you can look to the US. We are becoming an aging country. And so I think rapidly aging society, I think longevity, we are living longer. That impacts actuarial assumptions. And so the other big trend is the fact that we're working differently. And so gone are the days that a young person started with an employer in their, early 20s and stayed with them until retirement. Like that's not what we're seeing as normal anymore. There's much more fluidity, there's much more breaks, there's much more portability. And so with all of that, I would say, the biggest issues that pension plans need to do is tackle those changes. And it's not easy. You really need a multi-stakeholder approach to look at things like what is the age of retirement in sort of at a time when we're living to 100? How can we allow people potentially to transition into retirement instead of like this big break? And so starting to look at your plan design, starting to look at how people want to live their lives and really tackling some of the controversial issues that are out there. And then also cost of living. We talked a little bit about that. It's hard, employees today are struggling. And so how do we provide pension options that are affordable and continue to kind of go into the fundamental principle of secure, stable income? And so that's what I would say. I would say, overall, I think the principles of what makes the Canadian pension model successful don't change. All of those principles stay the same, but many of these plans, including OMERS, were created back in the 1960s, and they need to evolve and modernize to reflect today's world.
Changing that change where people are not staying at jobs for the bulk of their lifetime or their career. It's so true. Do you think that there is a future where there's more portability?
I think there has to be. And I think, like, I'd say two things. If I look again at sort of trends across the globe, not just here in Canada, if I think some of the big things are, number one, accessibility. More people need access to pensions. And so across the world, you're sort of seeing auto enrollment and sort of other things. I think Canada has work to do there as well. And so I think access to plans is number one. I think number two, to your point, we need to make them simple. We need people to understand what they have. And you need portability. And so you need to make it easy for members to transition their pension dollars to different plans. We need to simplify that process for sure. And I would say, thirdly, we need to continue to work on building trust. And I think that is a generational thing. I do think we have sort of a younger generation that questions things more than some of their predecessors have. And so more transparency, sharing more information, publicizing more information, having those conversations. People need to trust in the system.
How is OMERS, adapting both structurally and technologically
Yeah.
to remain resilient?
Yeah. I would say, again, fundamental principles haven't changed. If I think of OMERS, we were created back in the 1960s. We started the plan with like less than 10,000 plan members and about $5 million. And we started with the fundamental premise that, the desire that every municipal employee at the time should have access to the plan. And by creating the OMERS pension plan, you actually could ensure that you have access to the best, professional investments. People could pool their contributions, therefore creating, larger assets. You could share risk. And so all of those things, were the reasons we started OMERS back in the 1960s. Fast forward to today, over 665,000 plan members, over $140 billion in plan assets, more than 1,000 employers. And so those fundamental principles haven't changed. Access to invest globally in a diversified portfolio, that hasn't changed. What has changed, I would say, is a real focus on service modernization and relationships. And so really, really fundamentally understanding who our client is and getting to know like what makes them tick and how do we best serve them. And so what we're leaning into AI, we're leaning into technology as a tool. We are moving away from this, one size fits all product to what does a multi-generational membership need. And from a trust perspective, again, just being much more clear and transparent in, publicizing what we do, where we invest, how we think about climate and ESG and all of those things. Making information consumable for the average member has been a real big focus. But I would say number one is making sure every member understands their own pension. And so, what questions to ask, accessibility of their information in a way that they want to consume it.
And if we talk about technology specifically, how is AI transforming many industries like OMERS and in other pensions like OMERS? How is it starting to show up?
I mean, I think of AI like any other tool. Like from a technology perspective, AI should help us solve a lot of like operational problems, become more efficient, and help us simplify sort of the promise. And so I can speak specifically to OMERS. We are dipping our toe, I would say, in AI. AI is not going anywhere. You need to pay attention to it. We are leveraging it. We'll leverage it more over the years, but we are, I would describe it as dipping our toe into it right now. I think it really does play a role in simplifying complexity. And so how, you have access now to this tool to really help simplify those complex formulas and feed individuals information that is much more consumable. I think, you're seeing more predictive analysis. And so how do we leverage so much data and actually understand consumer behavior and patterns without having to spend, months and months digesting information. And so it's really, really helped from a predictive analysis perspective, operational efficiencies, like at the end of the day, we handle more than 150,000 phone calls a year. I run a contact center. So leveraging AI, not necessarily direct to the member, but how do we, leverage a tool for our agents? And so we have something called Agent Assist that really helps, our agents on the phone. So you're speaking to a live human being, but they have access to an Agent Assist providing them with information. And so that's really important. And then, repetitive processes that don't add value. And so an example that we've recently implemented is something called Call Summarizer. And so you speak to a member service representative, you spend, let's say, 10 minutes talking to them. At the end of that phone call in the past, that person would then have to type out a whole bunch of notes that took another 2 to 3 minutes. Now we have a Call Summarizer that just, does that automatically. And so we're able to actually get you access to a live person sooner. And so those are the things that we're sort of using it for. There will be a lot more. I think anything that is sort of routine and repetitive, you can definitely start to leverage, but we're cautious. We are not an organization that, at least at this point in time, will connect members directly to a bot. We do very much believe in sort of, if a member's calling us, usually it's at a really important time in their life. They're either preparing for a retirement or they're going through a hard time, right? They're, going through a marriage breakup, or they've become sick or disabled, a loved one has passed away. And so those moments in time, we believe it's really important for us to show up and have a conversation. And that to me, AI is about how do you keep the human there, but do it in a smarter way.
That's such an important consideration because we know that different generations like their communications in different ways. Younger generations don't necessarily mind talking to, a chatbot or an automated, service, whereas an older generation probably would prefer, a more traditional, human approach. It's how do you strike that balance, knowing, what that target demographic really needs? And there are layers, as you just put out, in terms of the timing when they are, reaching out.
Yeah, I think for us, it's a bit of a crawl, walk, run approach. And so if I look at where we are today, our members still primarily want to communicate with us live. We see it sort of in the, people coming to sessions and the phone calls coming in. But at the same time, we're building up the digital tools and capabilities so that you don't have to. And so right now it really is a connect with us in the way that you want to. And so it's about accessibility. But to your point, by about 2035, the majority of our active contributing members will be younger. They'll be Generation Alpha, Millennials, Gen X. And so I look at my daughter who's in her early 20s. I often use her as sort of a test case. She would never pick up the phone between the hours of 9 to 5 to speak to a live human. To your point, she would rather just do a quick chat or give me information in a different way. And so we are definitely on a path to more digital. And so really on that path to sort of saying, today we're dipping our toe in it. How do we kind of continue to go back to serve at the end of the day, our customer in a way that that they want to be served. But accessibility is important, and especially in a multi-generational base the way we have.
I think that goes back to public trust. So when pensions are well governed and forward looking, it does instill trust. And when it's not, and it remains sort of vague to the people it's there to help and serve, what does that do for that trust and the economic stability that you've just described?
I think trust is probably the number one thing, and it's easier to build trust when you're having sort of that human to human connection. The reality is, if I look at sort of this generation or new generation of members, they want information. And so to your point, it's truth is in the telling of the information and giving them the tools. And so we've really worked over the past few years on creating tools so you can go into, our member portal is My OMERS, and you can run your own calculations. You can, go and do sort of your own sampling. And so in the past, it was more you tell me and I'll take it as sort of, I'll take what you say and bank it. Now, more and more members are saying, no, 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 show me. I want to kind of do this on my own. And so empowering members to, through the right tools and information to go out and find their information, ask the questions, challenge the theories, and continue to sort of engage with us. That's what makes our work evolving and better. We have something at OMERS called our co-create community, and so we've got, I think, something like 10,000 members now who across all generations and, different educational backgrounds and different job occupations. We can test things with them. And so, if we create a new tool or a new communication, we can reach out and say, okay, does this resonate? And we'll get so much different feedback that we can then take back and try and, prototype a product that feels a little bit more intuitive with where we're trying to go.
So, if there's anything that you want listeners to take away from this conversation, what would that be? What's the most important consideration?
I think, to me, it really is the value of pension plans. Like, I think value of pension plans, not just to members. And so if you are a member that has access, number one, to a DB pension plan, I think that is like the gold standard. If you have access to a DB pension plan, you have secure, stable income for the rest of your life. Pay attention to it, understand what that means, ask the right questions, do the things that you need to do, challenge where you need to challenge. But like number one, that's a great place to be. If you don't have access to a DB pension plan, you might have access to a DC pension plan. Maybe you have access to group RRSPs. If you have access to nothing, then really, really, really start to plan early, prepare early, and think about your financial future. We all, focus on the next 5 years. We don't necessarily focus on the long term. And so really, I would say importance of pension plans to members, to society. How do we, fix the accessibility problem? And how do pension plans themselves really modernize and start paying attention to their members so that everybody sort of builds this trusted relationship in a way that, we can continue to amplify the value of these plans?
What books have you read or even, a podcast that you've listened to that has recently changed your perspective on, shifting trends,
Yeah.
anything, that has made you stop and rethink the pension landscape?
I mean, I feel like I do a lot of research. Like I spend a lot of time really trying to understand global trends and like looking at countries that have already kind of been where we're going. And so, if we think of aging populations, I pay attention to places like Japan and, some areas in Europe and sort of just seeing what are they facing and tackling and how are they doing things differently. So I would say general research on, figure out the macro trends and really go there. As far as like pension plan, like again, how people are thinking different. Like I've read the Blue Zones book. I've listened to, lots of conversations about that. We've worked with Simon Chan. He really focuses in on the arc of the life course. And so how do we think differently? Where, if we think of our old model of, you go to school, you then work, you then retire, how do we flip that around to say, well, that probably isn't going to be the experience of a 25-year-old today. It probably is. Maybe potentially you're working longer from a age perspective, but you're taking more breaks and fluidity. And so leaning into that, there's a book called Retire Often. I don't remember the author's name, but she really does lean into like these like many sabbaticals. And so how are we thinking differently? And so that's always really interesting to me. I can't leave here without plugging our own podcast. And so we have a podcast called The Pension Blueprint. Just, finished season 3. We'll be launching season 4 this year. It's one of the things I'm probably most proud of in my career because I do think we've provided really accessible information about pensions, but then also just about like how do you start to think about finances in a different way. And one of our guests, Jennifer Morehouse, has a podcast called More Money Podcast. She's someone I pay a lot of attention to because she's a young woman and she's been able to have a dialogue with the younger demographic and specifically women about, access to savings and asking the right questions. And, she talks about pensions, but just sort of this conversation about demystifying money. And how do we, especially women, do a disservice by not understanding necessarily finances? And so I throw those out there. But those are some of the things in this space that I'm paying attention to.
Great recommendations. Thank you so much, Celine. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today.